you. Good evening. Welcome everyone to another Black Community Ambassador Support Program event. We're so glad to have you with us. My name is Elizabeth Joy. I'm director of the Black Community Ambassadors Program. With me is one of our original founders, Kimberly Braswell. Really quick before we get started, just want to remind you, for those of you who have met us before or for those who are new to us, the Black Community Ambassadors Program was birthed last year. A group of individuals were brought together by Dr. Kevin Dixon at the ADAMH Franklin County organization to talk about Black folks and mental well-being, and specifically helpers, Black helpers. And we define helpers as counselors, teachers, community organizers, faith leaders, and some of us are just aunties and cousins who are just loving on our people the best way we know how. And so what we talked about was, unfortunately, the loss of several community members, most recently Amber Evans, Marshawn McCarroll, to name a few, who unfortunately took their lives through suicide, and just were heavy because of the work that they were doing. And we know many of us helpers oftentimes put ourselves before those we're serving, and as a result are struggling through. Now, of course, COVID-19 has happened along with the enhancement of an ever-going social justice movement, and we know folks are heavy right now. So here we are, Black Community Ambassadors Program, here to support Black folks, but specifically Black helpers. And we're so glad you're joining us tonight. We want to thank again ADAMH for funding this program and for supporting us in bringing together what we feel like is a solution that was missing specifically for Blacks in Franklin County, as well as MHAOhio, who hosts the program there to support us in making sure that we have what we need to be successful. So we will get right into it. Again, I'm going to pass it over to Kimberly Braswell, who will be introducing you all to our panelists, and we hope you enjoy yourselves.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth Joy. I definitely want to give a shout out to Elizabeth for the heavy lifting of the administrative work that goes behind the scenes of doing this. There's lots of moving parts with BCAST. We are absolutely passionate and personally invested in the work that we do. So I wanted to, on camera, thank you, Elizabeth Joy. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
So what we're going to do, because of what we do and why we do it, is, listen, family out there watching in Facebook and YouTube land, if I know us, we probably got 1,000 things going on. So somebody's probably watching this, trying to cook dinner, telling your kids to be quiet. Maybe the dog's doing something. I'm not sure what's going on with you, but I want us to make sure that we get grounded. We need to make sure that we know that even in the era of COVID, racial unrest and uprising, that we're still connected. And one of the most beautiful and ever healing ways that we can connect is by grounding ourselves. So before we get into the panel, I want to bring out, and by virtue of me saying bring out, I'm going to also give a shout out to Marco Arnold for being the behind the scenes holding us down, who will help us bring out Malik Willoughby, who will actually start us off with a grounding exercise. So Malik Willoughby, thank you for being with us today. Ground us, and then we'll get started in the convo, friends.
My pleasure, and thanks for the great introduction. It's an honor to be here. And I'm going to ground us, but I'm going to also include some sound, because there's therapy in sound, there's therapy in movement, and I'm going to ground us all through breathing. There's lots and lots of grounding through breathing, and it's a great way to get to meditation. So I want you to sit comfortably. So wherever you might be, if you're seated, and find your back against the chair, perhaps. You can place both hands on your knees. If you're seated in the chair, and if you're in an office setting, place your feet on the floor, flat. Close your mouth and breathe through your nose. It's a lot easier to concentrate on your breath this way. If you feel safe in the space that you're in, close your eyes It's less stimuli to feed your mind. Otherwise, lower your gaze or look down just in front of you, maybe a foot or two. Bring your full attention to your breath. So we're going to go inward to find our breath. As you accompany your breath as it moves in and out of your body through your nostrils, you're going to feel potential sensations, expansion and contraction of your throat, of your chest, and in your stomach. When you do a full belly breath, you should feel your belly and the lower cavity expand out as you breathe in. So you might find that at some point, your awareness may begin to wander, which is normal. Allow your mind to do what it does best, and that is to think. However, when you're meditating, when you're focusing, you want to figure out how to bring your awareness back to a focal point. And that's why breathing meditation is so important. So if you can, just keep your eyes closed. As you keep your eyes closed, again, come into the awareness of your breath. Just find that. As you come into the awareness of your breath, just listen in. Finding the awareness of your breath. After your next exhale, we're going to breathe in through the nose deep. Breathing out the nose, let it go. Again, inhale in through the nose. Exhale and let it out the nose. Again, breathe in through the nose. Exhaling out the nose. Again, in through the nose. Exhaling out the nose. Try it a couple more times on your own. Just being mindful to breathe in through the nose as your belly fills. As you exhale, you'll feel your belly button come back towards your spine. Just a couple more breaths here. After your next exhale, find your normal breathing once again. After you find your normal breathing, I'm going to do what's called a balanced breath. So you won't have to worry about counting. I'll count. All you have to do is breathe. This balanced breath is called balance because you breathe in to a count of 4 to 6. Tonight we'll just do 4. And you'll breathe out the same, out your nostrils, closing your mouths for the count of 4 as well. After your next exhale, begin to breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale and 4, 3, 2, 1. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale and 4, 3, 2, 1. Again in and 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale and 4, 3, 2, 1. Last one and 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale and 4, 3, 2, 1. As you rediscover your breath and rediscover your awareness, bringing yourself back to wherever you may be sitting, even if you're laying down. Slowly climb back into the awareness of the space. If your eyes are closed, if you've whispered them down just a little, slowly open them, finding yourself back into the awareness of the space. and let's have a wonderful conversation.
All right, so family, hopefully, a couple things. Thank you to Malik for grounding us. It's important for us to remember that when we have uncertain times, when we're in unprecedented history, that there's something that we always have. We always have our breath. We always have our breath. And so in gratitude for that, it's good to take a time to pause and recognize that. So in this moment, I'm going to welcome our panelists and give context for this, right? So I know in a lot of the spaces where I am, and maybe for those of you who are watching who are helpers in some space in the community, one of the things that we know of is that sometimes we get heavy, right? Sometimes the work that we're doing is really heavy, serving, supporting others. Those who give out and are resources for others tend to be the worst receivers. And sometimes we're not the ones who people are asking if we're okay. And sometimes we have bad days. Sometimes we get heavy. Sometimes we get sad, but sometimes it's more than that. And so what we wanted to talk about here with Black Community Ambassadors tonight is when it's more than just a bad day. What if it is clinical depression? What if it is bipolar disorder? What happens? And what happens with us when we as Black people are afraid of the label? We're afraid of the stigma. We're afraid about if we have to take meds, those kinds of things. So we have invited some phenomenal people. And I want to point your attention to something when they join me on screen now, is that our amazing panelists happen to be in this beautiful thing that's happening, all Black men. And the reason why this is super, super dope is because when we talk about the stats, and I'm sure Dr. Kearns can break some of this down, but when we talk about when Black folks are not participating, really actively contributing to our mental wellness, one of the first places we want to go to is Black men. Well, guess who's on here right now as our subject matter experts? Black men, and they're going to be speaking. I see the fifth, Malik. Yes. And we're going to be speaking through a lens of culture about this, and especially through the lens of those of us who are the ones supporting other people. So I just wanted to lift that up. And I want you to notice that. I want you to recognize that. So if you got some friends out there who are listening who are like, I don't see color, I'm going to say that's a whole nother conversation for another time and place. However, with that, I'm going to invite you to see color, especially in this conversation. And I want you to just see who is on here dropping knowledge for us. So with that, I'm asking Dr. Eric Currents, Dr. Gerald Jackson, and then Malik Willoughby to please, as we come into the space, I want you to share when we're going to be talking about mental health, mental wellness in the Black community. Do you have, as many of us do, a personal connection to why, of all the things on God's green earth that you could be doing for a profession, you were like, hey, let's do this messy work of mental wellness. Let's do that. Let's get it all in an entanglement of people's problems. Let's do that. Why did you pick this one? No? Yes? No? Let's start talking about it. So whoever would like to start first, and then what I'm going to ask us to do so that we don't have that awkward pause of when we wait for someone else to come off mute. And after you share, go ahead and pass it to the next panelist to share what is your story, our personal story. And I will also share too later about why this work.
Okay, I will jump in to prevent that pause. And so thank you for having us here. I think that it is an important conversation, and certainly I'm happy to be able to lend what knowledge I have to the conversation. And so my name is Eric Kearns. I'm a counseling psychologist with a private practice here in Gahanna, Ohio. And my journey to the space of mental health actually started with a degree in finance. So I am a businessman by training, and I went out to work every day and was successful at what I did, but I hated work every day. And so at some point, I had to ask myself kind of what the future looked like for me, what I wanted the legacy for myself to be, but what I wanted my experience in work to be. And I knew finance was not that. So I actually sought some career counseling, and out of that birthed this journey of going into psychology. And so I've both taught at the academic and collegiate level, but really have found passion and connection in working one-on-one with folks. And so that's what I do for the majority of my day. And I will say before I pass the mic that there was this very unspoken but real conversation within my family about what acceptable professions were. And so I can remember quitting my job as a financial analyst before having a conversation with my parents, because I was well aware of what that conversation would go, how that conversation would go. And my mom hates that I bring this up every time I talk about my transition. But when I sat down with them over breakfast, because I knew better than to do it at home, I wasn't going to have too much static happen in the middle of a restaurant. So I took them to breakfast, and when I shared that I was going to be transitioning back to school, my mom's initial comment was, but you're not going to have a job. Like, Black people don't go to therapy. Like, how are you going to sustain yourself? And so even that journey, recognizing that, whether it was perceived or imagined, there was already this expectation from me that as I embarked on this journey, that it wasn't something that was going to be readily acceptable within my family, which created, a pull in this space of moving towards destiny. And I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but I think that we're really going to then engage how those unspoken things can lead to the fear in seeking mental health. But that's my intro, and I'm going to pass it over to Malik.
And before you do that, Dr. Kearns, how's that wait list looking?
That wait list is long, but I'm working through it. But it is long. It's about 15
We're getting the help. That's good news. Thank you. And Malik, I believe Dr. Eric passed to you.
Yes. Can't say that I'm an expert at this. I had a time trying to unmute. Thank you, Dr. Eric. And we have Dr. Kearns and we have Dr. Jackson here. What Kimberly failed to mention is that I am the witch doctor in the room. So she didn't give me my proper title, but that's okay. I'll take that. What I will say is that my journey kind of started before me, if you will, from a history of generational traumas that I've kind of stored up in this little frame of mine. In my own very high ACEs, my own adverse childhood experiences, I've been surrounded by trauma pretty much my whole life. And without giving you the full story, because it's an actual novel, it became very important to me in working in the community, always working in the community, whether it was performing arts or whether it was recreation. Traumas always surrounded me in the communities that I lived and worked in. And I found myself and even my family members, and because my mother was a care provider, she was a mom for the community. What I recognized early is that people were always seeking other people for help because it just wasn't fashionable to talk about your mental health or lack thereof as Black folks. Even in poor conditions, even with the amount of issues that we've had and been having for generations here, but it's personal. So I'm here because it is like Dr. Eric, it's very gratifying for me to be in the business of mind body. And again, my name is Malik Willoughby, and I represent Mbube Institute, which is a mind body wellness business. I'm going to pass it to Dr. Jackson.
All right. Well, thank you, Malik, for passing the mic over to me. I just want to say thank you to everyone on the panel tonight, because this is a very important discussion. I don't want to make it too serious because I want people to understand and learn and listen to why it's important that this discussion is even taking place tonight. So let's keep it very informal. And that's what I'm going to do in my introduction. I've been very fortunate in my life. I feel like I come from a very compassionate family, but with the same type of problems that most of us have experienced. I lost my mother when I was only 18 years old. I grew up in two different families. My mother and father had divorced, and I had family that was dispersed all over the state of Ohio, and I found myself traveling to a lot of those places. I was in multiple schools as a child: elementary, middle school, and high school. So I really never had a place that I was in for a long period of time at once. Even though my mother stayed at a certain area, but I felt at some point that I needed to go stay with other family members. And I'm very thankful and grateful for having those family members to be able to do it. So I come from Southern Ohio. I'm just a young man who had dreams. You know, I'm a country boy, if you will. I went to the Ohio State University and got a degree in psychology because I do have a spirit and an energy of compassion for others. And that's mainly because that's what was showed to me. I'm really just giving back what I was fortunate and blessed to have throughout my life, whether it be with a family member or an extended family member or even a coach. You know, I love sports. I think it's very unfortunate for our young men and women right now that they aren't going to be able to have sports to lean on. So right now, this is a very critical time for all of us, not just adults who may be on this call, but maybe to a child or an adolescent who has the opportunity to hear our voices tonight as well. So what I want to say is that I'm going to speak from the heart. That's what I'm known for. I have been fortunate to become a pharmacist and learn a lot about medication. Education is my heart, is my desire. I love to give. Giving is the most rewarding thing that I think anybody on this panel could do, and that's what we're doing tonight. I've had the pleasure to study pharmacogenomics. Pharmacogenomics is basically how your body and drugs work. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because it's different for everyone, especially for African Americans. I've seen reports where drugs that we take potentially for mood may not work because of the liver, the way your liver metabolizes those drugs. Very important for you to know, but do you have the ability or access to know? As we know that African Americans or people who are Black and brown potentially do suffer disproportionately in a lot of things. And we may not go into all of those things tonight, but healthcare is one of them. That's a prime example of COVID-19. One of the ways that I'm giving right now is I've tested, either assessed or given a COVID-19 test to over 1,500 individuals. So what a journey that has been for me. And I'll tell you, the COVID-19 test is just a test. Those folks have many, many stories that I spent time listening to, and that was the real value and thing that I've cherished the most throughout the journey that I'm still continuing with COVID-19 testing. So looking forward to being on this panel, and I hope that if I don't answer your question tonight, feel free to reach out to Kim or myself via comment to say, hey, Gerald, I'd like to talk about whatever you said a little bit further.
Thank you so much, amazing people, for sharing your stories, both how the personal leads to the professional. And I do want to lift up how incredible that is, how personal leads to professional, right? How we find our passion sometimes in some of the pain points in our stories. I can't fathom what it's like when you're like making this finances money and you're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go back to school. And the family's like, we invested in you to do this. And I'm sure there was some fear and trepidation to say, no, we're going to swap this and do something different. And I have no idea what's going to come from this, right? From Malik, you sharing like, this isn't starting with me. This is starting before me. What that is speaking to is epigenetic trauma, which we never talk about. And there's a reason why, just like we pass on freckles and dimples, sometimes we pass on other things too, including traumas and mental health, right? And so thank you for the bravery. And sometimes we're so afraid we don't talk about what's in our family. But I need to know, like, I need to know what's in the family so I know what's coming up. I know I've had those conversations even with my own daughters about this is what's in the family. You need to know so that you're aware of how to take care of yourself. And thank you, Dr. Jackson, for also talking about like, we're afraid of medicine. And why? Right. And there's a reason for why we would be, right? And so, and I want to share just in full disclosure why I'm showing up in this space. Speaking to some of the things that you've all talked about, we have mental health and mood disorders in my family. We have addiction in my family. And I grew up with a parent who has bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, PTSD, and social anxiety. So as a child, not knowing really what those words meant, but I had this vocabulary. So I'm a little kid and I know what amitriptyline and carbamazepine and Haldol is, but my friends don't. So it's not something I'm going to talk about. But I grew up seeing my mom go to North Central and, I'm having these experiences that I don't hear the other kids talking about them. So I don't know if it's okay to talk about these things, but it's very prevalent in my family. And because we weren't talking about it, but my mom, I was blessed and fortunate that she went to counseling and she took her meds as prescribed, that it saved a lot of the fabric of what's happening in the family. But also there were a lot of spaces in my friendship space, didn't talk about it. In school, we had there were times when my mom was hospitalized. School administrators didn't even know that there's no adult home because Who, where, why would I talk about it? And I think that brings up this topic that I want us to speak to, and that is fear. There is this huge 4-letter word called fear that is in the midst of this conversation. And it's funny, I've been on Zoom all day today. I was talking with a young spirit today, young future leader, teenager. And one of the things he mentioned, that he went through something horrific. I said, who are you talking to? And yeah, we don't really do that in my family. You're carrying all this weight by yourself, and we don't talk about it. We can talk about hustling. We can talk about all kinds of stuff, but not this. So I want to make sure that we lift this up. So in general, but even regarding the specificity of how it relates to your subject matter expertise, the three of you, I would love to hear about how you see fear show up. So Dr. Currents, fear regarding therapy. Why don't we go? And if we do go, why don't we stay? Or what are we afraid to talk about when we unpack things? Gerald, I'd love for you to share, what are we afraid about regarding the meds? And especially if we're like, I know I'm going to just put this out here if we're having real talk. Some folks are like, I'm not taking meds, but weed is from the earth. It's from the earth. It's not a drug. Like, why are we having that conversation? Malik, I would like for you to talk about why when we say stuff like yoga, and let's be super real. I've been in spaces, even faith-based spaces, where say yoga, that's like devil worship stuff. It's like, why are we afraid of somatic practices where some researchers, particularly Bessel van der Kolk, a lot of what Malik Willoughby and Mbube Institute does, the experts have said, well, you got to have these somatic practices. And brown and black people, since the dawn of time, have known how to heal themselves. And it's a lot of somatic work that we just got out of touch with because the practice was to do it a different way here. Why are we afraid of body work? Why are we afraid of medicine? Why are we afraid of talking about our issues? Dr. Eric, I'm going to start with you.
And I think that we're all going to speak to this particular point, which is there's such a complexity to this conversation. So as I say some of this, I want to be very transparent that I'm painting with a broad brush, recognizing that this won't be everyone's truth. But I think that there are a number of elements that kind of rise to the top when we talk about this fear. And I think one of them is, and some of us have already spoken to it, there is a generational learning, a vicarious learning. We can refer to it as a generational curse if we want to, that is passed down from generation to generation in regards to what mental health is, in regards to what mental illness is, and certainly with in regards to the stigma associated with seeking help. And so I think it becomes one of those things where oftentimes we seek to have others that we love and that we value permission grant to tell us it's okay to talk to a financial planner, to tell us it's okay to get that physical, to get our numbers checked as African-American men. And that is something that historically has been absent within our community. And so we're looking for someone to say, this is okay. And that's a language that is not there for everybody. But I also think one of the other things is the unknown. We fear what we don't know. And so because we can't predict what's going to happen in therapy, we can't predict what is going to be opened up, that oftentimes that creates a barrier to seeking treatment or a barrier to being transparent within treatment. And so I'm often amazed at individuals who will come to therapy because they have experienced some level of trauma, and they'll say something in a first session like, I told myself I wasn't going to cry. And again, thinking to myself, what messages have you been taught that would allow you to be in a space where you recognize that, even if you don't call it that, you recognize that you have engaged a trauma, you recognize that some help is necessary, but you've already made the determination before you come in that it's not going to be an emotional process, that you're not going to let yourself fully go. And so even when we've reduced the stigma, we limit the probability or the ability to be successful within the conversation, because we want to be able to predict and control what it looks like, what we're going to talk about, etc. And then one more that I'll throw out, even though I have a bunch of other ones, but brevity, is I think that in many cases we see this as weakness, that we've been taught that to ask for help means that there is a deficit or a deficiency within us. And so, and I think that this is especially important for helping professionals. Here we are, we've been trained. This is what we do. We go to work every day and in some way, shape, or form help someone else in their journey. But now we have to admit We don't have it all together. And so being willing to see seeking treatment as something other than weakness, as something other than deficit, is some of the work that I think panels like this help to dispel, which is really important, because that is a major hurdle for people of color, but also for helping professionals that keep them from getting inside that room or having these conversations or engaging in yoga or medication, because I'm too strong for that, or at least society has led me to believe that that's the persona I need to project in order to be okay.
And you said something, Dr. Kearns, that I want to make sure before we transition from you. You said something that what I heard, and I'm paraphrasing, is feeling is scary. We are afraid to feel. Like, my God, what if I open this up? You know, I had somebody die, didn't really grieve them. You know, we had that moment, we did the repast, everybody ate some chicken unless we're vegan, right? You know, but what happens when we're afraid to feel? Why are we afraid of that? What happens if we lose ourselves in the therapy session? Speak a little bit about that whole fear of feeling.
Yeah, and I'll take it just a little bit deeper in that I don't know that it's always a fear of feeling. I think it's a fear of feeling in a way that I've determined is not socially acceptable. And I'll give you an example. I was working with a man just last week who was talking about how odd he found it that he could watch a movie, even a cartoon, and weep like a baby. Like, why is it that in this movie, I am crying uncontrollably, but here I am in therapy talking about ACEs and abuse that I watched my mom suffer and abuse that I've suffered. I don't feel anything. And it's because you have in your mind given yourself permission to feel as it relates to the movie, because that's acceptable. If something has happened and that's evoked sadness in me, I can say, oh, that movie was deep. But in therapy, I've not given myself permission to go there. And again, I think part of that is about fear of where that leads me. Once I open that box, I'm not certain that I'll be able to control it. And so it's much better for me to go and talk about the concept, but not allow myself to fully feel, because I don't know what's on the other side of that. And that's what I'm afraid of.
Malik, you said something inside of the breathing that I want to lift up, and I want you to speak to this as it relates to somatic practices. You said, okay, if you feel comfortable or safe enough, close your eyes. And if you don't, right, etc. What have you found in somatic practices and body work that speaks to what we do and what we don't know about our bodies, and what we do or don't know about what's scary about our bodies?
So I think like many things, and breathing is just a form of meditation, right? So that we understand. So some of us are just afraid of meditation. Some of us are afraid of getting it wrong, right? So we also look at it along the same lines as, so the most profound interaction you experience in things like breath work and things like tapping and breathing is your experience is that the interaction is with yourself. So sometimes just facing our own selves in the a very vulnerable part of who we are. When and working with a lot of Black young men, teenagers, and even older men, when we had the retreat, there was no difference in how emotions were shared in that vulnerable space with men between 19 and 50. But at the end of the day, the conversations that were had, and you may have heard some of it, Kim. I know you were far off and not in the circle of men, but they said they don't have any place where they can go and be vulnerable. So what I see Black men suffering to is the same thing that I see quite often are our Black helpers suffering to. It's one thing to say, well, I don't want to be vulnerable. It's another thing to say, I don't want to look vulnerable, because Black helpers quite often are the rock. So they're the rock in their families, they're the rock in their community. Sometimes they're the rock at work, and sometimes they have to be the rock all the time, and it doesn't give them enough space just to be themselves, just to be a little pliable, a little soft, and just to be human. So as a part of, some of that interaction, as you mentioned earlier, with somatic work, and somatic, it sounds fancy, but for anyone on this call, it just means body. And it's the interaction between body and mind and your emotions. But as a part of that, you would get in touch with buried and suppressed emotions when you start to do things like breath work. I've had people go into full blown just crying in yoga because things come up. those buried and suppressed emotions come up. People, and when you speak of fear, there is a fear, and Dr. Eric mentioned it. Some people just don't, want to say that this is socially acceptable. So when you start triggering those waves of anger, some people have just been mad, like you said something. I'm not mad at you, but I'm mad at them because something came up. There's triggers of waves of jealousy, and all kinds of things that come up. And it's not always just fear, but people don't want to do that kind of shadow work. And then you have to sit and sit deep within yourself, which is a hard and a very difficult thing to do when you're struggling with trying to reconcile, when you're struggling with trying to create balance and with an unhappy brain. So you feel uncomfortable in those spaces, even if it's seemingly just yoga. You mentioned earlier about how yoga can be disruptive to people who believe it's just a spiritual practice, and that it may disrupt their religious beliefs. But it's natural and healthy dimension of meditation practice for emotions to just come up. But when they come up, they generally gradually subside. But if you don't give them an opportunity to subside, then you feel like, I'm not going to tread in those waters.
So, Dr. Jackson, I want to bring you in on this. And in this way, we're starting to see some questions pop up. And one of the things that came up that I want to lift up here is these negative emotions, right? Negative experiences. I went through something, and this, so I'm really sensitive about people using the word triggered, right? Well, I was triggered. Well, triggering is a real thing. Let's not just throw this term out flippantly, right? But some of the ways in the community people talk about, like, either suppressing or trying to bypass that feeling of this negative thing pops up, and then I peak, and then I feel all of these things, is they say, well, I smoke weed. I smoke weed, so then that just keeps me mellow. Some people stay high so that the feeling never comes up, right? So I want to speak to this specifically because even recently I was facilitating a dialogue with young people, and I was asking them about street drugs. We were going through the ACEs test, and they were like, is weed an actual drug? Because we have normalized it, particularly in the Black community, to say, if I'm feeling anxious and I don't want to feel that negative experience, that negative emotion, I'll just smoke weed and then I'll be okay. And one of the reasons why I want to bring this up too is because a question had been asked about what are we seeing? What are some things we're seeing on the rise? One of the things we found out in the Black community ambassadors when we had our last town hall with the coroner is that we're seeing more overdoses in Black community, specifically with weed and fentanyl. Weed is not the same as when you would go to your auntie's cookout when you were younger and it was a little joint that somebody was smoking. It's a little bit different now. So, Gerald, can you speak to us about how we're sometimes using meds, particularly street meds, sometimes alcohol, and specifically weed, for self-medicating to avoid the negative feelings?
So yeah, that's a great question. Just real quick, I want to make one little point before I answer that with Malik. Breathing is one of the most important things that you can do to get through your day, get through your life, get through almost any issue. Here's why. So as our breathing begins to respirate faster, your body can go into what's called fight or flight. Once you go into fight or flight, you're talking chemicals in your body that no longer allow you to control your own decision making. So the moment you start to feel anxiety or stress, your body may be in more of a fight or flight stage of life. You no longer have control of your own vibration, your own breathing, and your own decision making. So that breathing is extremely important. That actually leads me into my point. A lot of things that we've heard tonight is about our subconscious, right? We're trying to tap closer into that subconscious and try to figure out why we have some of the rituals and patterns that we do every day. Marijuana, in my opinion, is one of those rituals or patterns that affects our subconscious. When we start to feel stressed, one of the things we lean on are those rituals in our subconscious. Weed and alcohol is one of them, right? Are two things that we see almost daily, right, from our friends. The moment we feel stressed, I got to have a drink. The moment we feel stressed, I got to light something up. And you know what? To some people, that may be okay, as long as it's not excessive. Marijuana is with enough THC can cause an overdose with psychotropic effects, right? It's going to penetrate your blood-brain barrier and begin to relax you in a way that lowers your respiration a little bit, just like marijuana would. But marijuana is different. There's so many different types of marijuana out there. You could have a laughing high, or you can have a real mellow high. So it's a very complicated thing to talk about in just a very short period of time. One of the things we know that it's doing, though, is it's changing your biochemistry. And anything that changes your biochemistry no longer puts you in the driver's seat. You are allowing whatever that drug or whatever that alcohol choice may be to now take the driver's seat and control your emotions and ultimately control your breathing. So why do people do this? I feel like a lot of it is African Americans feel like we've been experimented on a lot in our subconscious. That's one of the reasons why when I became a pharmacist, it was going to be a challenge just to talk to day-to-day patients. I work in primarily urban communities about why they should take a medication for blood pressure, why they should take a medication for mood, why a cardiologist is recommending something for heart. It's not because it's an experiment, but guess what? I understand why you feel that way. And many folks who are on medications for mood, you're wondering, is this going to work for me? And I'm here to hopefully convince you that yes, it can work for you. But I'll tell you this, I've seen plenty of people who are in very depressed states of mind that I can prescribe the medication for you to help control generalized anxiety disorder. It'll change your biochemistry. But if you don't, there are plenty of people that can overcome the medicine. I can give you 20, 50, 100 milligrams of whatever medication, but if you have the will to overcome that mentally, you will actually overcome the biochemistry that I'm trying to change for you to help elevate your mood. So I think a lot of it is just a matter of the experimentation on Black and brown people in the past. If you haven't, obviously most people would learn, we're talking about the Tuskegee experiment. But another person I'd like for you to maybe talk about is Henrietta Lacks. You need to look at those folks and what happened to them, why we have the stereotype towards medicine the way that we do. I'm not saying it's unwarranted, but that's why you have me in front of your screen today, to help educate you and give you some truth and a level of sincerity that we're not going to prescribe anything to you because we think, this isn't going to work for you. Don't get me wrong. There are some one size fits all approaches to medicine that does exist. But I'm here to tell you that the folks on this panel and the folks that you may need to seek out are going to give you the truth and help you understand if it's really good for you or if we need to look further. Did that answer your question?
I want to welcome. Yes, you did. And I want to welcome Dr. Currents. I saw you nodding about this. And I'd love your thoughts on, do you see this when we think about dual diagnoses? Talk a little bit about that, what that looks like, and what happens if you see a patient, you're working with someone and it's not depression. I mean, it's not just a bad day, it's something else. And if they need meds, what happens? Do you see resistance? And then what happens when that word creeps in about prescription? What happens and how do you deal with that?
So my experience probably or might be different than other individuals, but I'm going to share it because I think it's important. What I'm seeing actually is the exact opposite, that I'm finding that people are entering into therapy having already made the decision to take medication because they want something more immediately, and therapy is a process. And so there are times where by the time I get an individual in the door, they might already be taking some type of psychotropic medication. And so I think for me, one of the things that I'm finding though is there has not been a great deal of education prior to the prescription of the medication. And so I can tell you one of the issues that I struggle with is there are not a lot of psychiatrists in the area that are currently taking new clients that I have a relationship with. And so what ends up happening is individuals are going to their primary care physicians, and I want to be completely transparent and make sure people hear me. I'm not saying that that is a bad thing to do. What I'm saying is I have found that the screening process is not as robust as what would be the case if they were going to a psychiatrist. So I have individuals taking medications that they don't understand, where they've not talked about the side effects, and most importantly, to circle back to a point that you've made, where they've not been honest with their primary care physician in regards to their level of alcohol engagement or marijuana use, which adds a whole nother layer to this conversation that does need to be addressed. And so folks will come in the door talking about how the medication is ineffective and they're not medication compliant, or they have these other substances that they're using to self-medicate that are counteracting what the psychotropic med is supposed to be doing for them. And so again, I think it is a complex conversation, but I'm finding that the population that I'm working with is a little more comfortable talking about medication, but I don't know that we're at a place where they're utilizing medication well, which is one of the things that I try to provide some level of education for when they're with me. But again, it's pretty pervasive for someone to come in and literally in a 15-minute appointment with their primary care physician, walk out with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder with some level of medication. And again, that creates a whole nother list of things that we then have to work on through or against in some cases in our therapeutic work.
Thank you so much for that. And it makes me also think about how some folks are like, well, is there another way, right? Like if I have this diagnosis, is there another way? And Malik, this brings me to you for some, or maybe even if there's not another way, is there something else I can do in addition, right? Because the sweet spot is the three of you, like the magic of what happens when someone blends the three of you, right? I'm going to get my diagnosis. Okay, Dr. Kearns then gave me this diagnosis. I got some feelings about that, but whatever, right? I got my little label. But then now that I have this diagnosis, I can weaponize it for good to know. Now I know what this is. And it's not in my head. This is a thing that's happening. And then if I have a medication that's prescribed, this is supposed to help me manage this, right? So then I got my prescription from Dr. Jackson. He broke down for me how I was going to metabolize in my body, got that. But there might be some times when, for some people, the medication just takes edge off, but they might still feel things. So then what if then they gravitate over to Malik's space? Malik, what are some options for what happens that we can do with our bodies with, I know one of the phraseologies for Mbube is meditation and motion. What are the different somatic strategies we can use? And then do you have something that we can practice today?
And so, yes, thank you. Thank you there, Kim Bradlow. I think it is really important and key to understand that when you start talking about resilient strategies, plural, that you have a complete and full tool belt, not just a toolkit. Some of us have a toolkit, right? So some of us can't always dial into our therapist, but we do need to understand that even these things that I'm suggesting, like breathing and meditation, and I'll speak to tapping, even they're just long-term journeys, if you will, and they're healing and nourishing. However, if someone is facing difficulties that's beyond this help, meditation, it can offer the support needed and hoped for. And it might be that they need to see a therapist too. It may need to be that not only should they sit with someone, see a therapist, but it could be chemical in nature, where they will need to get a prescription from their therapist as well. So those are other things that we need to consider. And I wanted to just say that along with just having a full tool belt. So having a tool belt means, and thanks for mentioning that too, Dr. Jackson, that fight or flight that happens. That first type of breathing we did is called diaphragmatic breathing. So it's deep belly breathing. So the point of that is to employ that when you need to be calm. People are a whole lot wiser than we want to give them credit for, because when usually a loved one is out of pocket, someone says, hey, go take a deep breath. And taking a deep breath actually does a whole lot to stimulate that vagus nerve. So when you're out of whack, breathing is something on tap for you. The second type of breathing we did is called a balanced breath. Some people call it water breathing because it's balancing. So it's adaptogenic, which means it has this effect that if you're up, it can bring you down. And if you're down, it can bring you up. So there are reasons why you have, and there are different types of breathing techniques. Those two breathing techniques that that I shared with you today, that we all did together, they're two of the safest. So I did want to mention that by all means. I did want to make sure that we understood that there are all kinds of tools in the tool belt. One additional tool that I'll mention as well, and maybe if we can even take and do one short or quick round, is called EFT tapping, which is emotional freedom tapping. And it's a holistic tool that combines a bit of what would be considered psychotherapy with the statement, as well as from the East or from China, but Chinese acupressure. So I think she's around there somewhere. Margot, if you could pull that up really quickly before I take off here, because I got to take off. Sweet.
There it is. It's up.
There it is. It's up. So if you can see that graphic, and if you can, hopefully your screen is big enough. So you have what are considered these meridian points, or pressure points, if you will, and there are 9 of them. So you combine with touch these pressure points. You have, starting with the karate chop, which is on the outside of your hand or the blade of your hand, and you'll start with you'll start there, and the importance of starting there, and I'll have to make it as clear as possible, is that you want to repeat that. So you want to create what would be considered for some like a mantra. So you want that to be repeated over and over. So you want to understand that once you get into the fullness of EFT tapping, and I'll get into why it's important. But first, let's just think about what it is that you might be struggling with. It could be an issue that you're dealing with, and an issue in general, something that you can't shake. So tapping becomes that tool belt where you can take a break, just like breathing. And you would find that statement, although I'm dealing with fill in the blank, could be stress, it could be anxiety, I deeply and completely accept myself. You will take your index finger, your middle finger, and you will slightly tap on those pressure points, starting with the karate chop point. So as an example, and you can follow along if you like, although I am dealing with fill in the blank stress, I deeply and completely accept myself. Again, although I'm dealing with fill in the blank stress, I deeply and completely accept myself. Although I'm dealing with fill in the blank, I deeply and completely accept myself. You would then go just in between the third eye. So right in between, right there at the tip of the eyebrow, and you would tap lightly. Although I'm dealing with fill in the blank, I deeply and completely accept myself. Either side, it doesn't matter. You can take it to the side of the eye. Although I'm dealing with fill in the blank, I completely and deeply accept myself. You would then move underneath the eye. Although I'm dealing with fill in the blank, I deeply and completely accept myself. You would then move right below the nose, that mustache area. Although I am dealing with fill in the blank, I deeply and completely accept myself. You would then take those fingers and move to the chin. Although I am dealing with fill in the blank, I deeply and completely accept myself. You would move to your collarbone, either side. Although I'm dealing with fill in the blank, I deeply and completely accept myself. You would then move under the arm, but of course, right there along the breast line. Although I am dealing with fill in the blank, I completely and deeply accept myself. You would then go to the top of the head. Although I am dealing with fill in the blank, I completely and deeply accept myself. For some people, and I will say that this has been effective for folks who have even have dealt with PTSD. Tapping with fingertips on specific meridian points of the body, and then you focus on that negative emotion. So a lot of times folks want to feel like, if I just think good thoughts. However, sometimes you have to focus on the negative emotion or the negative or physical sensation that you're dealing with, and then it helps to calm the nervous system. Thinking about all the plasticity in your brain, it gives you an opportunity to say something negative and rewire the brain all at once. You can do that one time, or you can do that as many rounds as you need to.
Down tapping for us. Hey, guess what, Facebook and YouTube family? The good news is that we got people who not just talk about the stuff, but then go do other things, but they actually do the work. So Malik can't be with us for the second half because he's going to go do this somatic work and lead the community in being well. But stay tuned for next week, because when we are going to do our part 2 to this conversation, which is going to be talking about self-medicating, addiction recovery, we're going to bring him back in to talk about how we also use that body work to compensate for when we're trying to be in recovery. So thank you so much, Malik Willoughby from Mbube Institute. Marco, can we share the next things coming up for Mbube? Malik, any final words for us before you go?
I just want to express gratitude and say thank you, especially thank you to all the Black helpers who are holding up our communities and who are passing on all the gems to the next generation so that we realize our becoming. So thank you for just being present and doing what you're doing. Thank you for having me here along the panel and the beautiful brothers who are involved with the panel. Dr. E, Dr. J, I appreciate just being involved. I'm your neighborhood witch doctor. I'm Malik. I'm going to go take off so that I can do some work in the community.
Thank you so much, Malik. Marco, if we could throw up the graphic. This is where Mbube Institute is going to be in the community coming up. Malik and a awesome person named Alfred Wilson they are leading an initiative called Bronzeville Active for free. If you ever want to just get active, they have walkers, runners, bike riders every Wednesday, 6:45 and 7 p.m. Saturdays at 8 p.m. if you want to just get active and moving. Malik will be leading something called Sunset Yoga at Sunset on these following dates coming up: 7:30 p.m. Impact Box Park, that's going to be in the Bronzeville King Lincoln neighborhood, August 20th, August 27th, September 3rd. And then he'll be leading something called Yoga Outside the Box, and that will be with a special guest to be announced September 5th on Saturday, 10 a.m. So wanted to share that. And with that, we're going to do something a little bit different, a little special, friends out there. It's easy for us to have these experts talking about all these ways that they're dope and do all these dope things and keep people well. But we wanted to welcome a couple folks to share their stories. So if I could have Elizabeth Joy to join us. I'm welcoming my own daughter. And if we have Dee McCall in the studio, I want to welcome Dee into the space. And Charlie Braswell, come sit by me. And what I wanted to do is what we wanted to do is create some space for folks to actually share about their stories and their experiences, so we know this is a real thing. But part of how we dispel the myth, how we bust up this stigma of not being well and just living in private and suffering in silence, is talking about our stories and knowing that there's no shame, and it's talking about our experiences, our stories. There's power in it. So first, I wanted to give space for Charlie, for Elizabeth, and Dee to share just a quick snippet, just a few minutes of how you belong to this topic. And then we're going to welcome the experts back for just a little dialogue, a little interplay about what are our next steps? How do we improve community? How do we process negative emotions? I want to give a shout out to Tiffany for bringing that topic up about like, hey, sometimes this stuff feels negative in my body. How do I push those experiences? Shout out to Mr. Luke, who asked the question about how do we then take all of these rising issues that are coming up in the community and try to make improvements. And so we had our panel of experts. We're going to hear from the ladies right now. But know that when you hear these stories, this represents so many stories in the community. So I'm going to start because she's a college student, so she can't stay with us forever. But Charlie's going to share a unique lens of this that we haven't talked about regarding mental health and mood disorders, and that is panic attacks and self-harming. And so, Charlie, I want to create the space for you to go ahead and share your story.
Hi, I'm Charlie. As she just said. So yeah, I have severe anxiety and severe depression, which I was diagnosed with probably at the age of like 12 or 13. And And so it manifests in panic attacks and self-harm and just like really bad anxiety in pretty much all forms. So like how did the
So what I asked Charlie to share is we talk inside the Black community sometimes about anxiety, depression, those kinds of deals, but we don't always talk about self-harm and in the unique ways it shows up. I think sometimes we just think cutting, but that's not the only way the self-harm shows up, and that's not the only way panic attacks look. So if you could just share a little bit about what your self-harming has looked like and then what you do to cope.
Okay. Yeah, so I have self-harmed a couple different times in the past couple years. So sometimes, usually the main one that I'm still like working through is scratching myself and also ripping the skin off my fingertips, which I think is actually really common. Like when I ask my friends, like, if they've ever seen that before, it's actually like a lot of people do it. But yeah, I actually did it today, just out of anxiety. Sorry, did it today out of just, anxiety. And then yeah, I have like scratching spells where part of it is like I have skin issues, so I'm just like itchy. But like when I get really, really anxious or nervous or angry, I just physically am like itchy or just feel the need to like scratch my face or scratch my arms or my legs or whatever's just accessible. So that's sometimes how it manifests. I've also choked myself before, just like, just wanting to feel something. And so I think that's why a lot of people self-harm, and it's really detrimental because at the time you're thinking like, this is how I cope with it, this is how I'm feeling right now, so I'm just gonna do it. I don't really care how it affects me. I don't care. You're not thinking about like if anybody's watching or if it's affecting anybody else or how it affects you long term, but you're just doing it to kind of get through the moment, I think. Yeah, that's usually what it looks like when I've self-harmed in the past. And I try to cope with it by doing the things that make me happy and that are not negative coping mechanisms. So I listen to music a lot. I play music a lot. So I used to play the violin and now I play ukulele. I paint, I sing, whatever is like creative that gets my hands moving without me harming myself. That's what I try to do. I cook, I clean, it's just anything that keeps me moving, anything that's productive. I don't work out because I don't want to, but that's something active that I have done before that actually really helps, and it's really good to do. And then, yeah, so that's the self-harm aspect. And then the panic attacks come when I'm at either my lowest point or my highest point. And so that's why I think sometimes people think it's just when you're at like your highest point that it comes, but it actually happens when you're at your lowest point too. It doesn't have to be like I'm freaking out and then I get my anxiety attack. It can come out of nowhere. And so I've had panic attacks in class. I've had panic attacks during a test. I've had panic attacks in a store. Like it it just happens. And it feels like you're dying. Like it's a lot of shortness of breath. It's cold sweats. It's like shaking. It's like you can't speak, you can't move, you can't do anything, and you can't talk. That's the most frustrating part. It's like not being able to communicate how you're feeling, not being able to get it out all the way. And usually for my panic attacks, I can't really control them, so I usually have to take my panic attack medication for that to get me back down. And usually after that, I'm like, let me just go to sleep because this is not it. I'm not feeling it, not liking it, not my favorite thing right now. So usually I just try to go to sleep after panic attacks. But yeah, panic attacks are pretty scary because you don't know. I think like the first couple times that you have one, and even still now, I've been having them for so long, but even now it still feels like, is this going to end? Am I going to die? Is my heart stopping? What's going on? Am I going to have a heart attack? What's going on? And it's so confusing and scary. And especially if you're not around people that you feel like are going to comfort you the right way, that's really scary too, because you don't know how they're going to handle it. Sometimes what hurts more than people not or people, you know, all touch. That's another thing. People touching you when you're having panic attacks, like, freaks you out. You're like, why are you touching me? Get away. I'm trying to calm myself down, and then you're touching me, and I don't want that, and I like karate chopping you in your throat, and you're gonna be mad about it, and then I'm gonna have another panic attack, and it's just a mess. So, like, don't touch people when they're having panic attacks. But another thing is, what was I gonna say?
Well, we can pause there.
Yeah.
So, and then what I want to do really quickly, shout out to my BCAS people for just being team, gang in this, is really quickly, if we can pop on the screen, Dr. Eric and Dr. Gerald, any thoughts on some of Charlie's experiences before we hop into hearing from Dee and from Elizabeth? Do you see panic attacks? Do you see some self-harm happening? I'd love to hear your thoughts, Dr. Eric, on what this looks like, particularly for Black folks regarding panic attacks, self-harm, and then regarding meds. What does that look like for us? I'd start with you, Dr. Eric, and then we'll go to Dr. Gerald.
So I just want to thank Charlie for sharing, because I think that is one of the things that really empowers other individuals to be willing to address the things that they experience. That universality of experience really does help us. So thank you so much. And yeah, I see a lot of what she is talking about. And I will say one of the pieces that I think is most important in regards to the experience of panic attacks is it's another example where this language or conversation or socialization around mental health is playing out. And so I will have a number of individuals who will present to the ER over and over again, looking for somatic responses. They feel like they're having a heart attack or something of that nature. And so they're looking for a medical diagnosis. They're comfortable with the idea of a medical diagnosis, and oftentimes kind of connect to this idea of it being anxiety as a last resort. I've gone to my third specialist. I've been to the ER twice. And now, you know, everybody's looking at me saying we've exhausted every other possibility. Could it be anxiety? And so I think, you know, being able to recognize that some of these symptoms that she spoke about are manifestations of anxiety, and being able to call it that so that we can get connected, whether that be through therapy or through body work or through medication, to things that actually have the ability to help us, is certainly something that I see therapy as being very active in that educational piece. And I also appreciate what she said in regards to, very often we think of harming behavior as cutting. And I think that there are so many things in addition to even what she shared that individuals engage in as an ability to control and or alleviate the pain of the moment. And so sometimes, again, we're not connecting the language to what's actually happening. And I think that that's beneficial, because it's in that connection that we can actually look at what services and services or service providers that we can utilize in creating some help around what we're going through.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, there's a lot of things happening. Thank you for sharing the story. I think there's a lot of healing in that, just for sharing your story. I mean, it's energy to me right now to even talk as much as I'd love to talk about this topic. But, you know, unfortunately in the mind, once again, you know, goes back to breathing a little bit here. Even when we're feeling a little stressed, we want a reward. We're human beings that like reward. And unfortunately, reward can be a little obscure sometimes, and present or manifest itself in harming ourselves or even harming someone else. So I'm glad that you've acknowledged that, because obviously you don't want to harm yourself, but at that moment, that's what you felt like was rewarding. And that's exactly when I would say it may be time for something like medication. You described it perfectly. There's so many people that actually think they're having a heart attack. A young lady like yourself would turn to your mother and say, I'm having these symptoms. And she may assume you are having a heart attack, when really it is just a panic attack. But because there's a level of familiarity, you're surrounded by people that you know, you're surrounded by the right energy, they're aware of what you're experiencing. They're aware of how to respond. So when you're someone that feels the way that you do, it's extremely important that you surround yourself with people that understand what you're dealing with. And that way, there's a level of comfort in that for you. And that it's actually a way to help, a pathway, in my opinion, to help you grow. The medication in this situation would probably something be like a Xanax, an alprazolam, something that's very short acting, Bring your respirations down. Again, we go back to that breathing. I'm telling you, that's one of the most important subjects we could talk about tonight. And once we get the breathing under control, we can get your vibration, we can get your mind, we can get everything else in your body to be back in what we call that back at homeostasis, if you will, at least for a short period of time until we can figure out what may have getting back to another word we talked about was the trigger for that panic attack.
Thank you so much for that, Charlie. I didn't know before we lose Charlie, did you have any questions for them? Because we've got like a therapist and a psychologist, a pharmacologist right here. I didn't know if you had.
I don't really have any questions. I just really appreciate what you guys said, because I think it puts, I don't know, it just made a lot of sense to hear from you guys, like what you've seen other people, how other people feel. And you even see it like on TV when it's actually kind of well represented, where it's like, oh my goodness, like I'm having a lot of heart issues, or I feel like I'm having heart issues and my heart is racing and I'm like, oh, I can't breathe. And then they go to the doctor and it's like, nothing's going on. You're just having a panic attack, or you're having an anxiety attack, which are two different things, which I don't think people understand. So I really appreciate what you guys said.
Thanks so much, doctors.
You're welcome.
Yeah, getting this work in for the Black community,
Let's
people.
do it. Hey, we got all night.
That's how we do it. All right, so I'm going to welcome in now Dee. If we could bring Dee back on screen. Dee, go ahead and share your story with us about your experience, your relationship to this topic.
Hello, my name is Dee McCall. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, but I'm actively doing work in Akron and Summit County. I am a part of the support group on Tuesdays. I am 30, just transitioned out of the military, recent graduate from Akron, University of Akron. So I'm currently in a transition of like careers and then also in my life journey. I am a community helper. Most of my jobs has been working with almost every aspect of the community, the homeless, battered women, working at the Boys and Girls Club, being a community organizer with the womb, and working with women getting out of jail from the Oriana House in Summit County. So I've actively been a person of the people, a civil servant, anything that you can think of. And the support group has really been a great resource for me to help me understand that the issues that I'm going through are not just me. It's not a me issue. It gave me the courage to really speak about how sometimes I'm truly just fucked up, and it's okay. I used to just have this extra strong face when I'm in most spaces, and majority of the time I was probably depressed. So it is a relief and just something that I feel should be a resource to everybody, because it really helped me understand more things about myself and how I could do better and unpack and really just face my stuff instead of like avoiding it or numbing myself. Dr. Eric said we had this persona that we want people to see about us, and I wanted to be Xena the Warrior Princess. That was one of my favorite TV characters. But I had I wanted to be that strong person, and those unspoken cues when the only two emotions I ever knew was I was happy and I was mad or sad or hungry. Those are just my emotions that I ever described myself with. So I kind of forgot where I was going with that, but I'm a fan, and I think that this is a resource that everyone should really have access to.
And Dee, can you share a little bit, especially because of the work you do in community, can you share, especially for those who might be out there listening who do so much, I help and I support and, and all that good stuff, right? What was it that pushed you to say like, yo, I got to prioritize me, because we know that we'll selflessly keep serving until we fall out. What was it that motivated you to put yourself and I don't know whether we say it's above the movement or if we say to know that in order to support the movement, I got to make sure I'm okay. What was it that actually pressed you enough to say like, let me join a support group and do this work?
It was either something that you said or Elizabeth said, and you guys said that the ultimate protest is self-preservation. And that hit me so deep. I'm like, oh, I receive it, Lord. Yes, that was my message. It's for me. And also another thing is when I had an interview, a job interview, and they asked me, how do I keep my balance? And it really had me stuck because I play sport, like I play basketball and I go running, and I just started kayaking. And I thought that was me trying to have a balance in my release. However, I really wasn't having a healthy release, and I didn't have a true balance. And then I think it's been 2 months since I've been in a support group. These 2 months has been like the game changer of my life because I've been more mindful and just more intentional with my relationships and identifying when I could just say no. And that's been the most powerful thing I've been doing, and staying hydrated. But yeah, those have been my two, just really finding a healthy release and having that support at the support group, because we're all peers. We're not in the same space technically, but I feel like we soul tied already. Like I'm locked in.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm welcoming Dr. Eric and Dr. Gerald back into this space too. Dee, I don't know if you have any questions for them, but there was something that I heard that I wanted to make sure that I lifted up to them. And you didn't say it directly, but I wanted to make sure I put it in this space about the power of words, the power of definitions, and being able to have something to speak to describe what I'm feeling, the importance of that. The other thing that you said, Dee, that I wanted to make sure that I put in front of you, especially for you, Dr. Eric, is you were saying, like, I show up in these spaces, and I've seen you in spaces where you're just illuminating and you're smiling and everything, but you're like, I was depressed a lot. There's this thing called a smiling depression. Mm-hmm. And so, Dr. Eric, I wanted to have you speak to the smiling depression and speak to having words for this. And then as we relate to words too, as it relates to even when we do get to the point of meds, sometimes it's important to describe how we're feeling so we know if how we're being treated isn't correct. So I want to start with you, Dr. Eric.
Absolutely. Well, shout out to Dee. I'm from Canton, Ohio. So big ups. And thank you again for sharing. And one of the things that I think is important, and often we talk about this as it relates to anger, but I think that we can talk about it in regards to our overall presentation. We often refer to anger as a masking emotion because it's an emotion that we're comfortable allowing other people to see, and we're not as comfortable talking about our hurt. We're not as comfortable talking about betrayal and other emotions that might be more primary. And I think that that mask of what we show other people when we're smiling through our depression is an example of that. And there are a couple of things that I think are important in this. Sometimes we don't have a language to give it because we've never admitted to ourselves that we're actually in the space of masking. I think we've gotten so good at doing it that in the moment we are experiencing happy depression and we don't even know it because we've not sat with ourselves long enough to admit the truth of where we are. And so I think part of what the benefit of therapy can be is that we allow you through your own journey to connect your own level of language, because the other thing I find is we want to use everyone else's language. I heard this person say that, and we're trying to attach our journey and our experience to someone else's language. And then when it doesn't fully connect, we're wondering why we've stagnated, and we've stagnated because we need to develop that language for ourselves. And so it might sound off the wall, but if someone's having an experience, just for the sake of helping them to understand that they don't have to fit into someone else's circle or square, I'll say, you know, that emotion that you're feeling, describe it in a color. Tell me what that color is. And let's talk, use your own language to describe what that color means. And when I initially ask it, they're like, what is he on? But I think what we develop over time is this sense of, I can call it whatever I want to. The success in it is fully understanding what it is, how it's impacting me, how I get underneath it so I can start on the journey to healing. But I think one of the biggest pieces of that is the awareness in the moment that I'm smiling, I'm the life of the party, and there's something fundamentally different going on the inside of me that I've not yet identified or admitted. And so I'm not sure if I fully answered your question, but I think that certainly is part of the initial step of that conversation that is so important.
Dee, any thoughts on that before I branch into what I was going to ask Dr. Gerald?
Oh, no, I receive it. I feel like this is just more affirmation for me because everything that you're saying, it's been told. So it's just like, you know, showing up in other faces. So thank you.
And Dr. Gerald, one of the things this reminds me of, speaking about language, and thank you so much, Dee, for sharing your story. Dee does all of these things, and in the midst of all of the things that Dee does, she popped up and was like, yeah, I'll share my story. This is how we break the stigma, family. This is how we do it, by saying like, yeah, I got some stuff going on, and I'm still productive, and I'm still a veteran, and I'm still dope, and I still have great hair. How about that, right? So, Dr. Gerald, what I want you to speak to regarding this topic is, as it relates to words, I think it's also, and I can speak to this from watching my mom. My mom was diagnosed in 78. And so she's been, and that was before they called it bipolar disorder. That's when it was like dysthymia, cyclothymia, all these kinds of words, right? Before we get to what is it? And then how do we medicate it, when they were just like lithium, boom, right? But one of the things that is really critical that I saw in my mom's story, that it reminds me of Dee talking about words, is it was imperative for my mom to have the right words to express how she felt on her meds, so that they knew when the meds were wrong. Mm-hmm. So Dr. Gerald, talk about when we know, like, sometimes what we're fearing regarding meds is it's going to make me feel this way, or it's going to do these things. But talk about the importance of language, so that when we get in front of someone like you, we can have a more informed conversation about how to be well.
No, that's a great question. Indeed, thanks again for your testimony and how transparent it was. One thing that jumps out at me real quick before I answer that was that, you were living with 3 to 4 emotions every day. And most people will tell you there's about 2,000 emotions out there that we could experience on any given day. And 3 to 4 emotions is not what we want you to experience. So I encourage you to find as many different experiences as you can to open up more emotions for yourself, even if it means trying different foods. But your testimony was powerful. But yes, Ken, that's a great question. So the hardest hurdle for most people to overcome is just be willing to ask a question. I get so many people that are coming in to take a medication that their doctor told them about, really didn't go into any detail because they're seeing 2 and 3 patients every 15 minutes. And they just take it. And I promise you, I'm going up to some of these folks with a new prescription, almost all of them, if you will, and saying, hey, do you have any questions about this medication? And a lot of it may be because they feel like they aren't educated to just say the word like lisinopril, which is a commonly used medication for blood pressure, or Lipitor is a commonly used name for drugs for cholesterol. So don't be afraid to butcher the name, because this medication is something you're going to be taking every single day, and it's going to be altering your biochemistry. You want to understand it. That's where the healthcare professional trust is such a big deal, because many of these folks don't want to ask a question because they don't have the trust in the healthcare professional. That's why there needs to be a 24-hour newscast of programs just like this, so we can make sure people are completely aware that there's not misinformation, that we're all saying the same thing, and those questions get asked. I encourage you, if you pick up a prescription and if for whatever reason you don't have the courage to ask a question, or to even answer it with maybe all of the energy you may have, go home and read the pamphlet. Go home, don't necessarily look on the internet, but find a reputable source to research that drug, and read everything you can about it if you're afraid to ask those questions. Because I promise you, if you just put that much energy into trying to understand the medication, you're going to probably come back to me on that next refill and say, hey, you know what, Dr. Jackson, I heard that this drug potentially can cause my mouth or my tongue to swell. Something as obscure as that. And I can say, hey, you know what? It sounds like you've been doing some research. And yes, that is a possibility for certain populations. But based off of what the medications you're on and the month that you already had on this medication, it's not something that I expect to happen to you.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Dee. And before we lose Dee, I want to say this. Dee mentioned a word, and I want to lift this up for those, particularly the helpers and the organizers, sometimes feeling angry, right? First of all, I want to say, y'all, Dee been putting in this work. I've seen her smile, and it's so good to see Dee smile, right? And that is some of the release that we get from just talking about this. Yeah. Trauma, mental health, mood, just all this, talk about it, because it gives us a release, and it gives us that boost of serotonin to know we're not by ourselves, we're still connected, right? So that's a good thing. The other thing is this. sometimes we have picked helping for the wrong reasons. We're angry. We didn't do the work that we should have done with Dr. Eric and Dr. Gerald and Malik. We didn't do the work. We just went in. We like, I'm really mad. I'm really pissed off about all these social justice issues, and I'm going to go help because I'm really angry. But that might not be the sustainable emotion that we need for the long-term journey to do this work. Anger takes a lot out of us. But do y'all remember, family out there, if you ever saw the movie Monsters, Inc., remember how they were trying to scare everybody to power the factory? Do you remember what worked better than the screams? It was laughter. I just want to remind us that there's a joy in getting well and in being well. And I think that our smiles, like that smile Dee has, like the work that we're doing, that's part of the revolution too, right? And that's part of self-care as a revolutionary act. And so is my smile, and so is my laugh. So you can't have any of those things, and you can't have my joy either. So thank you, Dee, for being part of this. Thank you, Drs. Eric and Gerald. And then I'm going to welcome our very own Elizabeth Joy to give a little bit of her story. And Elizabeth, one of the things we haven't talked about that I love so much about your story and your honesty about it is, we got some people who are like, listen, I'm not about these drugs or anything like that, but I will have a beverage.
Yes.
Because they're like, that's legal. I didn't do nothing, ain't nothing wrong with that. So I would love for you to speak a little bit to our story, our relationship with mental health and the drinks, the tasty drinks.
The drinks with an A. Wow. I mean, there's a lot to share for myself as a licensed independent social worker and as a leader. I think too, you have, as helpers and some of us also in leadership positions, you have these reputations, right, that you're trying to uphold. And so for me, I have a significant history of trauma, including sexual abuse as a child for most of my life, my childhood life with my oldest brother, and trauma throughout my childhood with my father and brother, who are both police officers who ultimately physically assaulted me. So, it was an interesting journey because, I had it together in the sense of being successful, licensed, and then I left the field for a while and did real estate finance, was making six figures, was feeling myself. And so, when you're feeling yourself, you go and you get drinks and you kick it. And so for the early part of my years, I was helping folks, and meanwhile, really wasn't, at the time, I didn't realize how unhappy I was. I felt like everybody else had a problem, and I just don't know why these people don't get themselves together. And then I would kick it all the time. And so drinking, I saw it as fun. And I think some of it was in my younger years that I was having fun. But, as time went on, I realized that was really something. Sometimes I did it for fun, but a lot of times, as soon as I got angry, which Dr. Eric, you spoke to only having, or it was maybe Dr. Gerald, one or two emotions. My primary emotion was anger. For most of my life, I really didn't have a lot of other feelings. So anytime I would have the least bit of anger, I would be like, I gotta get a drink. So that was like very much part of my lifestyle. And because in America, especially, and really in the world, alcohol is it's almost unacceptable not to drink. I would say it's harder to not drink than drink because, and I've gone sober for several years, and it's like people look at you crazy if you say you don't drink. So because it's such a socially not only acceptable, but almost expected thing, it's really easy for it to be threaded into your response and part of your lifestyle to be well. And I don't sit here to say that there's that I'm denouncing alcohol. I still drink alcohol. I have gone, like I said, completely sober, but at some point in my life, it was part of how I managed. And every time that I got angry, I drank. And it's so ironic because you're like, oh, I'm gonna drink to calm myself down, which we know that that's not actually what happens physically. But in my mind, it was helpful. So it was definitely something that I used. And then there was a time when I actually did go on medication. I went on Lexapro. And even as a licensed clinician, I had my concerns. To your point, Dr. Jackson, I knew some stuff about potential, that you could be potentially homicidal or suicidal. And I knew I had a history of suicidal thinking. So I'm all smart, like, nah, I don't know about this. you know, but I ended up doing it. And I think one of the things that also people get scared about is like it changing them. But, you know, I was still able to be myself. And in my case, I was on meds for a few years. And as I was working through therapy, I eventually got to the point where I did not need medication and I'm not on it. So I think it's also important that we know that sometimes that's not the case, that you'll have to be on it forever. But if you do, that's cool too. So yeah, alcohol was definitely a part of my life more as a solution than a casual thing. And so, and I think too, just being a helper, it was, when you think back about it, like I think I did great work when I was helping people then, but it's nowhere near what I would do now because I didn't have myself together. So yeah, that's my relationship with alcohol. And I'm thankful that I've come a long way in that healing, but it absolutely was intentional work to get to the point where I'm at the place that I'm at now.
Dr. Eric, Dr. Gerald, talk to us a little bit about, and I'm not saying that this is what this was, right? But talk to us a little bit about what it looks like when someone might come into your space and you've got a dual diagnosis. I remember a student that I was working with when I was in the K-12 system, and the student presented with something that looked like mental health, and then we realized, oh, we've got something else going on too. So we're actually treating two things. Thank you, first of all, Elizabeth, for sharing that story. There are so many people out there who are like, I'm good, I just drink.
Yeah.
It's like, well, are you just drinking socially, or are you drinking a lot? Or are you drinking it? And like some people are drinking and it's like, well, it's not every day, but do you abuse it when you do it? You know, and so thank you so much for lifting that up, because I think there are some people who are thinking, as long as it's not an illegal substance, I'm good.
And it's still the number one killer. Even during the opioid epidemic, alcohol was still the number one killer. So yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And also too, thank you just for, and if y'all don't know, you need to check out how dope Elizabeth Joy is, because she also, in telling her story, thank you so much for sharing your trauma story too, right? That's a lot to carry around and recover from. And I want to lift up too that she does work where she takes people from not just being survivors of something, but you can be thrivers, right? And so please check her out for the work that she does with that specific trauma-informed emotional intelligence. Dr. Eric, Dr. Gerald, talk to us about dual diagnoses. What does that look like when it shows up?
I can talk about it if you like. So a lot of times with dual diagnosis, you know, it's all about the shortcut to the reward sometimes, right? You know, how do we get there faster? Some folks who have diabetes, right, you know, they have many other things associated and linked to diabetes, right? It's not just the diabetes that's causing their pain. A lot of it becomes a lifestyle of many other things. It becomes your blood pressure becomes affected because of your diabetes. Your body is completely inflamed because of the diabetes. And those three things combined, and not necessarily having the ability to get out, potentially leads to depression. And many people don't want to acknowledge the depression. So and a lot of times I'll see people who are depressed and kind of ate their way into diabetes. You know, they kind of ate their feelings. It had nothing to do with diabetes initially. It was the depression that caused the diabetes. Now, I know that may be an easy way to just have a discussion tonight. There are obviously plenty of other reasons why someone could have diabetes, just diet in general. But I find a lot of times folks who are diabetics end up on some type of medication for mood, because the eating has led to a depression, and that's caused them to go on medication that they didn't necessarily think that they needed to be on. So that would be that would be a differential diagnosis that I would see a lot, more than anything that more than any other thing I see in my pharmacy.
Dr. Eric?
So the two things that I'll add is I certainly see a high level of comorbidity or dual diagnosis with mood disorders and substance use and abuse. But the larger thing that I think is important is oftentimes when it comes to initial presentation, individuals will come to therapy and share what they're most comfortable with. And so that's when it becomes my job to make sure that we're looking at the holistic picture of who they are, how they're engaging, because oftentimes, again, someone might come in willing to talk about the depression, but maybe not recognizing that the level of alcohol intake that they're engaging is problematic and creating some other issues. And so I think that one of the things that I always do is I'm hesitant. We have to give a diagnosis because insurance says in order to get paid, you have to have one. But really, for me, that is such a secondary part to that initial conversation and creating that treatment plan, because so often, and the biggest example that I can give is back probably about 7 years ago. I had a woman present who was clearly experiencing a major depressive episode, and she clinically met the criteria, and she came in pretty comfortable with therapy and very able to say, I'm depressed. Here are the reasons why I'm depressed. I'm struggling to work through it. And just in the back of my mind, my spidey said something else is going on. And there was a part of her that just needed to be comfortable enough to share. But within 6 months, she shared this horrific history of trauma, and she actually met the criteria for dissociative identity disorder. And so if there was a part of me that just heard that initial piece and spoke to that depression, there would have been all of this stuff that she would have left therapy never having addressed. And so I really think it's not that we go searching for things that aren't there, but that we really leave ourselves open, that initial presentation, even if accurate, is often not the whole picture. And in order to really create wellness, we need to do our best to make sure that we're seeing the whole picture.
Thank you so much for that. I want to, again, give a shout out to our director of BCAS, Elizabeth Joy, for sharing her story. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I love you, boo.
Thank you. And I do want to speak to, Tiffany asked a question about knowing when coping mechanisms become addictive. And I'm sure the Dr. E and Dr. Jackson have something to add. So I would like to answer that as the not the expert, but as the person who was struggling at the time. And I talk about this in my book. We oftentimes go through that struggle, and then so something happens, and then we're doing all we can in that moment. You can't sit there and judge yourself for how you figure out how to cope. You just do what you can when you're in the middle of crisis. So sometimes that's picking up a drink, sometimes that's having sex, sometimes that's spending money. It can be all kinds of different things. But, I talk in my book about the depriver stage is when we're depriving ourselves of life knowingly or unknowingly. And so I don't think you always know right when, but you kind of look up. And when it gets bad enough, you realize that this has become a way of life. It shifted from something I was doing to get through to a lifestyle, and you start to pay those prices, right? You lose relationships, you get a DUI, you start to struggle in school, right? Maybe your memory's starting to get a little foggy, or maybe you just aren't quite as sharp or as driven as you used to be. But it's different for everyone. But for me, it was just like, something's up here. And then I started searching for answers. Keep in mind, at the time, I'm a licensed clinician already, but I started reading more. And the more I read, the more I started to see myself. And I'm like, oh my God, this is me. I read Courage to Heal. And it's like a big old book by Laura Davis. It's the best book I've ever seen on sexual abuse and how it affects people long term. And it wasn't until I had that information in front of me that I realized, wow, like my whole life is being really authored by this trauma that I had, and all this stuff I'm doing is in response to it. And this is why trauma-informed work is so important that Kim and I, we talk about all the time. But when you don't know about that stuff, it's hard to know that you've turned a negative coping mechanism or a small fix into a lifestyle. But you kind of start to know because things start falling apart. What do you think, Dr. E? I see you nodding your head.
I completely agree with you. And the one thing that I want to add is I think that there are times where we can even take positive coping strategies and allow them to prevent us from doing the work. And this is probably going to sound counterintuitive, but there are some individuals that I think at times will use therapy as a positive coping strategy that allows them to not have to fully engage the work. And so they'll show up week after week and month after month. And at some point I have to challenge it that we're not reaching your intended goal. And so there is a part of you have the cheerleader, you're getting the knowledge, but you're not doing the work. And so even though I'm not going to say to you that coming to therapy is a bad thing, what I can identify is that you're using the coping strategy of coming to therapy to prevent you from doing the work. So I think it's important, to the point that you made, Elizabeth Joy, that there is this knowing that we come into if we allow ourselves, where we recognize that whatever the coping strategy that we're attempting to utilize is not getting us towards our intended end. And in those moments, we have to be willing to reevaluate. And it doesn't mean that we have to immediately disengage from that coping strategy, because there might be something positive we're getting from it, but we need to be adding something else in to make sure that that progression is still happening.
And I would add that I think that's where helpers, and we've seen this in our support groups, we're seeing folks who become counselors and become activists, and become all of these things. And because they're doing good, that becomes, as you said, a positive, negative situation. So I think that's a great point. Go ahead, Kim.
And I just wanted to lift up too, for those of you who are listening to this, and I actually hope this is happening. I hope someone out there is listening like, do I need to go to therapy? Probably. Is that what's wrong with my significant other? It's probably wrong with you too, boo. So I think both of you should go get checked up, right? But with that, I wanted to note something that just happened in there that's really powerful. If you're going to have some helpers, particularly a therapist, what I love that Dr. Eric just said is, you want a therapist who's on their stuff enough to be looking at you like, why are you coming here? What are you doing? Right? I remember you saying something on another panel that we were on together, Dr. Eric. You said, what is your why? Like, why are you coming here? What are you actually trying to achieve? What is your goal? What is the outcome? And to both of your points about, like, when we talk about, the phrases come up, and I see it mentioned. Shout out to Sharonda for holding it down and keeping us focused. An example of doing the work. I know I even talk a lot about do the work. I'm like, what does the work look like? To your point that you said, both of you, Elizabeth, will also be a Dr. Elizabeth, and Dr. Eric, is sometimes doing the work, air quotes, is a supplement to doing the work. Like, I run and I meditate and I burn sage and I'm vegan and I do all of these things. And it's like, but if you look at Samson's model of 8 dimensions of wellness, and if you coming on strong with the 7 and your emotional wellness is trash, we got work to do, because the goal is to be well in all areas, right? And so I just want to make sure that we pay attention to holistically being well, holistically being okay, and paying attention to, like, when I have got a drop or a deficit here, am I paying attention to every part of my being to know, like, that's why we didn't just do this conversation and only have Dr. Gerald or only have Dr. Eric or only have Malik. Malik would also tell you, I do all the somatic work, but if I need to go to the doctor for something, I'm going to do that, because it takes all of us, just like it takes community. It takes all of these things to be holistically well. Elizabeth Joy.
Yeah, so Amber, thank you for your question regarding doing the work. So here's what we literally mean by doing the work. Doing the work means you choose to no longer stuff that happened to you and it's bothering you under the rug and in the closet, and you face it full on. So often what we're seeing, and I know Dr. Egan speaks to this, is that folks, we got stuff from years ago that and Black folks are infamous for saying, I dealt with that, which meant I stuffed it. And so do the work means acknowledging the pain, acknowledging what happened, and acknowledging how it's affecting how you see yourself, others in the world, and then working through and correcting that. So for some of us, that's something we can do on our own, reading some books and processing, maybe doing some yoga and learning things. For other of us, we need some therapy. For other of us, we need therapy plus meds. For other of us, we need all of that. But doing the work really truly means that we are acknowledging and working through, rather than sort of, scooting past that. And Tasha, you asked about supporting a loved one I'll let Gerald speak to that. Kim, you can bring that up. But supporting people who are struggling through trauma, I think is also can be challenging because we really want to help people get better. But sometimes everyone has to choose to heal on their own, and we can't make people be ready for the healing. There are things you can do to support, but at the end of the day, you also have to be ready for the possibility that your loved one isn't ready. And what does that mean for you? I'll go ahead and let you all speak to that as well.
Well, the only thing I would say is that, a lot of folks, even when it, relates to medicine, they go into the whole taking medication for the first time and wanting something that's going to certainly change their blood pressure. It's going to certainly change my blood sugar. It's going to certainly change my mood. Well, guess what? That may be true. It may certainly change your blood pressure. It may certainly change your diabetes. But don't be afraid of the uncertainty. The uncertainty is maybe you're going to be off the medication in 6 months. There's appreciation in certainty and there's appreciation in uncertainty. Only thing I would encourage people to do tonight is take the first step. Be certain of that, and then appreciate the amount of uncertainty that may come your way, because it may be more beneficial than you ever thought it would be.
Yeah, I think, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I want to just chime in very quickly and say that sometimes we see support as, to some degree, strong arming individuals into treatment. And I can tell you with almost 20 years of experience, it never works. And so as a general rule for myself, if an adult calls to make an appointment for another adult, I'm not going to see that adult because I already know how that plays out. And so even really recognizing what support looks like, but to the point that either Elizabeth Joy or Dr. Jackson made, it really has to be a choice that someone makes to show up and do the work, because if we force people to engagement, they will engage, but they will likely not sustain. And so sometimes it's about granting that permission, reducing that stigma, and allowing them in their own timing to come to the space where they're willing and able to do the work.
I want to mention something right here before we get into another question that came up in the chat. And thank you so much for our friends in Facebook world for putting the questions out here. We need you, we need you, we need you to do this work and to break the stigma. I'm also grateful to BCAS because we had some folks share their testimonies. We put some videos up to have people talk about their stories. And I had a friend, shout out to one of my friends in Charlotte, North Carolina, who called me and was like, yo, having an issue with a family member. And I don't know what to do. I want to know if we can talk about supporting when we got a loved one. And part of what my friend was saying was that they had a loved one who not diagnosed, but they have incredibly risky behavior. They're using substances to cope. They're not okay. There's like, it's obvious that they're not okay, but they're also lashing out, right? And the one person who wants to help them, they're hurting me in the process. I don't know what to do. How can I support them? And know that we can't drag folks to therapy, right? And so can we speak to what do we do? What do we tell my friend out there who's trying to figure out, what do I do about this family member who is in a bad way? And not only are they being harmed, but because they're in a bad place, I'm being harmed in the process too. How do we do that? I know we got 8 minutes left, but I want to make sure that and thank you to Sharonda, Margot, Elizabeth for making sure we're seeing and lifting up the questions that are coming up.
I'm just going to speak real quickly because I think that I'm going to take a completely different perspective on this and talk about children, because many of our adolescent teenagers and children are watching moms and dads experience exactly what you just talked about. So I'm hoping that we can continue to find resources for those kids to identify what it may look like for a parent who may be experiencing some level of addiction, and don't make them be afraid to talk about it, because they're not, they potentially may find a mother or father in the bathroom and be afraid to react. One of the things that they need to do is maybe even someone talk to them about what text message to send and who to send that text message to. So, I'm not necessarily a counselor, but I want to look at it from that perspective, and hopefully that anyone listening to this, they'll talk to their child or a loved one and say, hey, you know what, this is what you do if you find someone who you think is suffering from some level of addiction and you're in fear for your well-being.
And the piece that I'll add is if I were talking to your friend Kim, one of the things that I would suggest is that she actually engage in some level of therapy. And here's why: because sometimes in those situations, mental wellness is about you coming to terms with what you have the power to create in that environment and what is outside of your control. And we go back to that very initial thing that we talked about. Sometimes why we don't seek treatment is because we don't want to give up the control. And I also say that I think sometimes as helping professionals, or the person in your family that is always kind of the person who's trying to help, there's something going on within you that leads you to that space as well. And so, yes, we want to get them taken care of, but sometimes there's some unresolved stuff even within you that keeps putting you in that space where you're the person trying to fix someone else or make sure they get to that space. And so I think that this would be a person, I would say you're a great proponent for therapy, because there are some things that probably need unpacked, and you probably need some support in figuring out how you can deal with that family member who is creating some level of mental distress for you.
So for all those of you listening out there, did he just call me out? Yes. Go get this help. Elizabeth Joy.
Well, and that actually has come up in our support groups quite often, where folks are really wanting to bring along a loved one, a family member, a boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, husband, partner. And I my story, I've had to I've changed my last name and completely don't talk to one whole half of my family anymore. That was after years of trying to bring folks along and bring it together. But you get to a point where, I think sharing videos like this and events like this is a starting point, also not being judgmental and accepting of folks. Those are things you can do to help maybe see, because maybe it's just the stigma that's preventing them from wanting to get help. But I think there has to be that line where, if we're years into trying to help somebody and it's to the point where it's hurting you, as Dr. E spoke to, it may just unfortunately be a situation where there's a boundary issue, and that you're going to have to be okay with the fact that your loved one might not be ready right now. And we cannot make people be ready to heal. You can't. They can't even really make themselves be ready. It's just this thing. I know for myself, I knew long before I started on my healing journey that I needed to do it. But I always say, until the pain of change no longer outweighs the pain of being the same, you're probably not going to shift. And so you have to know, when you're talking about a loved one, they may not have hit that point. It's not about what you say and what you do. It's just that they're not to that space. And before we go, I know Tiffany asked a question that I think is really critical that we hit on before we go. She asked about, is wellness identified by our resilience? Some of us believe we will be on a peace train all the time once we heal. And honey, let me tell you about how that's not the case. I think we have to be careful about what even the word healed means. I use the word aliver, survivor to aliver, and that just means we're no longer defined by our past, and we now have the tools and skills to engage in a better and more stable coping journey or healing journey when things come up. Once you get to that point, you're able to better manage challenges. But y'all, we ain't no arrival. Arrival is death. So we're going to always have our battles. And so we're really not aspiring for life to just be awesome all the time. We're aspiring to be in a point where we're no longer defined by things, and we have the skills and the toolkits that we can quickly go to. And so it's no longer something that's going to take us down for 5 years. We can process through that and do what we need to do, call the folks we need to call. Maybe we're not in counseling anymore. Maybe we go back for a little while, but please believe there'll always be, things we have to work through. Go ahead, Dr. E. I know you got something on that.
Believe it or not, I don't. I'm going to say echo ditto. She said it all. And I guess I do have one thing, that sometimes wellness is about setting the realistic expectation that wellness does not mean absence of pain. Wellness does not mean always being good. Wellness is about this ability to cope with the fact that life is not always well. And so sometimes our mental well-being is really connected to our ability to set realistic expectations for ourselves and for those around us.
Beautiful. And I was going to say, and so here's why I love y'all so much and why y'all are so dope. Because before that, I was going to ask y'all, what the next right thing is. What is the lingering word that you want people to know or to think about? And for you, Dr. Eric, I think that's perfect of letting us know, like, wellness is a journey, right? And to know, like, everything's not going to be perfect. What do we need to do? And I think that's our next right thing, is just paying attention to that. I love that. Dr. Gerald, what do you think is the last thing you want to leave folks with in this particular conversation on tonight?
Well, there are plenty of people out there that are doing just fine tonight, right, Kim? There are plenty of people out there that are very successful, living a life of well-being in every way that they thought it would be. But there are plenty of people who are not. So I would just encourage those people to do one thing, and that's just take a step. Tony Robbins is a great motivational speaker. I listen to Tony about every other day. But one of the things he always talks about is his favorite quote is, you don't have to be great to start anything, but you got to start to be great. So make sure that you're willing to at least start something if you really want to achieve greatness.
Absolutely. Folks are just dropping gems.
Keep following that. I think we should just stop
Sprinkling
now.
gems, right? Right. Malik led us in levitation in the beginning. The doctors lead us in the end with these powerful words. I don't know if we had any commercials that we wanted to share about what BCAS has coming up. But the only words that I wanted to leave folks with, and then we'll leave the last words in the very capable hands of our director, Elizabeth Joy. But I just wanted to remind everyone, there's this beautiful word, Sababona, means I see you, right? We see you. We see you, family. One of the beautiful things about being connected through this Black skin is we have a way that we are related and connected. And that means that even when y'all aren't okay, we can feel you. We feel each other. And we feel when the stuff's not right, when we're not right, right? And so this is a plea to us as a collective, the 3 U's, individual you, collective you, universal you. We are connected, we are united. And it is our desire, our moral imperative to make sure that we all get to be well. We all have a right to be well. And so this is our invitation, a sustaining, perpetual invitation for you to be well. Our next town hall is going to be this coming Wednesday, the 19th. This one is going to be talking about self-medicating. We're going to be talking specifically about self-medicating, addiction, and recovery. We're going to welcome back Dr. Joe Jackson to talk about the meds, Malik Willoughby, and we're also going to have Dennis Sumlin, who does a lot of chemical dependency counseling. And we're going to have more testimonials and stories talking about our relationship to self-medicating, to addiction, and to recovery stories. We thank you so much for all the ways that you support, not just us, not just the BCAS folks, but what we really thank you for, helpers, is how even without the experts in this call, we are showing up for each other. There's so much going on in the world. Please don't stop showing up for each other, but just make sure that when you have that long list of people you check on, make sure you're on your list. Make sure you're on your list. We got our support groups running Mondays, 2 of them on Tuesdays. We got a learning community. So we see our Black men. We got something just for you. 6 o'clock on Mondays. Organizers, if you're out there trying to rally the troops, every Tuesday at 12, we're meeting. We're here for you. And for our helpers, in any way, and in a general way, if you're a helper, Tuesday, 6 o'clock, every Tuesday, we are there waiting for you, ready to support you so you can put down the work for a second and practice being good receivers of this stuff. Get loved on. You deserve it. And if you did nothing else, family, if you did not one more thing, you are so worthy. You are so worthy of being loved. You are so worthy of good care. And you are so worthy of being well. I'm shutting up. Elizabeth Joy, do you have anything, awesome leader?
Well, I think you said everything I would have said, Kim. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you again to ADAMH for funding us, to Mental Health of Ohio for hosting us. Thank you, Kim, for facilitating and moderating. And again, thank you to all you Black helpers out there. We know you're out there. We know the work you were doing well before COVID, well before the social justice heightened movement, because it didn't just start. And we really, really encourage you. Please join us in the support groups. We're here for you. We know the stigma is real, but I hope that by sharing our stories of ups and downs, you know you're not alone, and that you know that we're here for you. Please come see us again. Mondays, Black male helpers, we're here for you, 6 to 7. Tuesdays, 12 to 1 for our organizers and advocates. And then the general Black Helper Support Group is again on Tuesdays, 6 to 7. We'll see you guys next week, next Wednesday, same bat time, same bat channel, 6 to 8, where we'll continue this discussion. Thank you again for all you do. And remember, self-care is an act of resistance. Have a great night.
Keep human trafficking on the radar as well. Have a good night, everyone.
Absolutely.